Grip socks are great, and now they're even better with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Better fit, moisture wicking, amazing comfort, and all the extra grip you need. Choose from 10 different colors for just $16.99 a pair at puregripsocks.com.
The Nike Mercurial series was introduced all the way back in 1998, 24 years ago, with the latest generation just releasing in the form of the Vapor 15 and Superfly 9. It's one of the longest running lines of football boots ever and arguably the most famous, but the big question that I think needs to be answered is this: is the Mercurial actually getting better? Well, there's only one way to answer that, and that's by going through the entire history of Mercurials one by one, see how they evolved over the years, and discuss whether or not the latest is actually the greatest. And really quickly, if you enjoy your football boot history, please don't forget to support this video with a like, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, along with hitting that little bell notification so you get notified when my next new video goes live. 1998, arguably one of the most important years in football boot history, the year Nike launched the OG Mercurial. Not Vapor, not Superfly, it was just the Nike Mercurial at that point. And unfortunately, I don't have a physical example to show you like I will for every other generation of Mercurial as we move forward. I've never even had the opportunity to play in a pair of 1998 Mercurials, so I can't really comment on how they fit, feel, or perform. However, what's so important about the OG Mercurial is not just the fact that it's the first one, but because it's the introduction of the speed boot concept, something that at that time was completely the opposite of what every other brand was doing. When you consider the Adidas Predator Accelerator was the most popular high-tech football boot back in 1998, the contrast between that and the OG Nike Mercurial couldn't be more significant. It went against all the football boot trends at that time, opting for a synthetic upper when everything high-end featured kangaroo leather, the material being KNG 100, that's the name Nike gave it, KNG being short for kangaroo. So they wanted to mimic the feel of leather, but have the weight reduction that you could get from a synthetic material. They thinned out the sole plate, they went for a more aggressive stud pattern. It had a modern vibe and an emphasis on speed that we had never seen in the football boot industry up until that point. The year is 2000, and Nike introduces their second generation in the Mercurial series, specifically two different options. The Match Mercurial, which was kind of the slight update when compared to the original Mercurial model, and the Air Zoom Mercurial, which is what I'm holding here in my hands, effectively the same football boot, but with the introduction of Air Zoom tech in the forefoot and toe box area, something that is particularly relevant to today because 22 years later, the Vapor 15 and Superfly 9 are now reintroducing Air Zoom tech into the Mercurial series. Granted, it's very different, and in terms of today's wearability standards, I don't think the OG Air Zoom Mercurial from 22 years ago is all that playable and really all that great a pair of football boots, but what this really represented at the time so early on is Nike's emphasis with the Mercurial line to push the boundaries of what was possible in terms of introducing new tech to benefit fit, feel, and overall performance. 2002, the introduction of the Nike Mercurial Vapor 1, and another super important year in football boot history in that with this football boot, Nike more or less changed the way football boots would look forever. When you consider that the Adidas Predator Mania was also a current model back in 2002, the contrast in design and concept could not be more significant. The Vapor 1 strived to mimic the fit, feel, and responsiveness of a sprinter's spike, but in the form of a pair of football boots, introducing this super thin, streamlined upper called Nike Skin that offered a barefoot feel unlike anything else we had ever seen on a pair of football boots. Pair that up with a super aggressive stud pattern, this being the soft ground variation, but the firm ground one, if you look at those boots, it's going to look very familiar to the Mercurial stud patterns that we're used to seeing all the way in 2022. Again, this really was so far ahead of its time in terms of what it introduced. As far as modern playability is concerned, the boots are very tight, they are very stiff, and they are very uncomfortable. If you're looking to get a ton of blisters, the Vapor 1 will definitely do that for you, but if you want that barefoot sensation, as long as you don't have any nerves in your feet, These do that just as good as pretty much anything. 2002, Nike introduces the second generation of Mercurial Vapor, the Vapor 2, which, as you can see, looks a lot like the Vapor 1. Slight variation in the graphics. The little stripe is the giveaway in terms of what makes this a Vapor 2, and realistically, they didn't change much. It's the same basic concept, the same Nike Skin upper, although this time around, maybe a smidge softer, very similar in terms of sole plate and stud pattern design, and overall, still a super thin, streamlined football boot that was way ahead of its time. Again, if you compare it to other offerings from other brands in 2004, these look like spaceships, and again, in terms of modern wearability, you can make an argument that the Vapor 2 was a little bit more comfortable, but in general, by today's standards, these are blister machines. 2006, Nike introduces the Mercurial Vapor 3, the first major redesign to the Mercurial Vapor concept that at the time, I think was very well received. I would personally argue that this is one of the best looking Mercurial designs Nike has ever released. However, when you really look back at the history, and especially what the Vapor 1 and Vapor 2 were, the Vapor 3 is an example of the Mercurial series kind of getting on the heavier and chunkier side despite the super streamlined look. Instead of Nike Skin, it introduced Teijin Synthetic, something that would become a staple of the Mercurial Vapor and Superfly series for years to come. Super thin, but still relatively stiff, especially out of the box. The blister pads through the heel, this foam material that looks quite inviting and comfortable, but will rip the skin right off the back of your heels within minutes. The introduction of carbon fiber, not just in the form of this external heel counter, but with the insole removed, you can see there's actually a stiffener shank that runs directly through the midfoot to reinforce the sole plate, a split sole construction, a brand new stud pattern, this of course being the soft ground layout, and a weight that was significantly heavier than the Vapor 1 and 2 that came before it, but overall a football boot that again was still way ahead of its time when compared to the competition, with Adidas at that time offering the F50.6 Tunit as their speed boot offering, and those weighed as much as a brick. And as far as modern day performance is concerned, the lockdown is great. I think the touch is solid as well, despite the slightly stiffer feel to the upper. And I definitely think the traction provided by either the FG or SG stud pattern would do the job today. However, the boots aren't as light as modern Mercurials, and from a comfort perspective, they are way, way, way behind. These are seriously some of the most uncomfortable football boots I've ever had the pleasure of wearing. 2007, Nike introduces the Mercurial Vapor 4, a football boot that introduces a very different look for the Mercurial series with the introduction of a lace cover as well as the giant Nike swoosh, something that's kind of become a staple within the Nike brand at this point, but back in 2007, that was pretty controversial. A lot of people hated the way that these look. Of course, you have the glossy finish to the upper, which is pretty much standard on most Mercurial Vapor 4 colors, aside from some special ones, and it still had a Teijin synthetic upper that got a little bit thicker, but also a little bit more pliable. It maintained the blister pads in the heel, although this time around, it was a little bit more comfortable, but you were still pretty much guaranteed to get blisters. The introduction of this glass fiber ring, essentially, that acted as a heel structure, and then of course wrapped the midfoot area with the new split sole design that more or less carried over the exact same aggressive stud pattern. The boots also gained a little bit of weight and also got slightly wider and increased in volume in an attempt to make the Mercurial a little bit more accessible to people that didn't necessarily have super slim feet, because realistically Vapor 1 through 3 were fairly slim fitting, low profile football boots that squeeze your feet pretty aggressively. As far as how the performance holds up, despite being pretty cool looking in my opinion, they're not very light, they're certainly not very comfortable, and they don't fit as well as modern day Mercurials. You probably wouldn't want to wear them. But the Vapor 4 was not the only Mercurial model to come out in 2007, because they also introduced the Vapor 4 SL, which you can see introduces a full-length carbon fiber sole plate with an external heel counter also made from carbon. Granted, the amount of carbon within this sole plate is pretty minimal. There's basically just enough there to give you the carbon fiber look. It's mostly just filled in with resin and other hard materials, and the stud pattern was actually slightly modified, eliminating a stud, I'm assuming for the sake of saving a little bit of additional weight, because as you'd expect, this was a lighter variation of the regular Vapor 4, and from a performance standpoint, there really wasn't a huge difference. You could make an argument that the traction was worse because they eliminated some studs, but also for whatever reason, the boots seemed to be more comfortable through the heel. The major downside, however, was the price tag, retailing for $300 all the way back in 2007, and also durability. These sole plates were prone to cracking really early on. I was fortunate to get a pair of these when I was a kid once they went on sale, and they cracked within my first hour of use, which was extremely sad and disappointing for childhood Josh, but that's besides the point. It's a really cool pair of football boots. I think the performance ages a little bit better than the regular Vapor 4, but again, by today's standards, you probably wouldn't want to wear them. What's also super important to note is that the Vapor 4 SL was more or less the Superfly before the Superfly. And even though it wasn't an official inline Mercurial model, I'm sure enough of you will bring it up if I don't mention it. In 2008, specifically for the Champions League final, as worn by Cristiano Ronaldo and Didier Drogba, Nike released the Mercurial Carbon SL, a full carbon fiber variation of the Mercurial, taking the sole plate from the Vapor 4 SL and an upper entirely made out of carbon fiber. They were limited to 2008 FG pairs. They also made some soft ground pairs that eventually got released to the public. Unfortunately, I never had a pair. They retailed for $400, which was absolutely insane for the time. And if you've ever seen a used pair on eBay, they don't really wear all that well. The carbon fibers, the actual fiber within the upper itself, seems to fray really quickly as it's bent from actually playing in the boot. So I really view this as more of a concept boot than anything. I can't imagine they felt all that great, but as a concept, they were extremely cool. And once again, it represented Nike trying to push the boundaries of what technology could be in a pair of football boots. I would say more so than any other brand at that point in time. 2009, Nike introduces the most high-tech football boot the world had ever seen in the Mercurial Vapor Superfly 1. It too featured a carbon fiber sole plate and introduced Flywire for the first time in a pair of football boots, paired up with their super thin Teijin synthetic upper, holes in the studs for reduced weight. The boots were absolutely insane and retailed for $350. However, the release did not go without a significant speed bump in that when pros finally got to wear them about a month before they would drop in stores in this exact colorway, several pairs actually exploded in a match. Everyone saw that, of course, and Nike panicked, making some changes to the boots and eventually releasing them in future colorways, with the main difference being the slightly thicker upper and the elimination of the blister pads in the heel. This pair is actually a sample pair that never ended up releasing to the public. Nonetheless, the football boot looks insane. Again, considering these came out in 2009, they are extremely modern visually by today's standards. And as far as performance is concerned, they stack up quite well. However, like so many early Mercurial models, they are incredibly uncomfortable. This is one of the most uncomfortable football boots I've genuinely ever had on my feet. Again, as a kid, I was fortunate enough to get a pair once they finally went on sale for somewhat of a reasonable price, because these retailed for $350. And the first time that I wore them, granted it was in the wintertime in Canada, very cold, not a good idea. I lost both of my big toenails. The boots are incredibly stiff, blisters on my heels. They were terrible to play in. Nonetheless, from a performance standpoint, just based on comfort alone, you probably wouldn't want to wear these in 2022. And if you didn't have $350 to spend on a pair of Superflies, Nike also released the Mercurial Vapor 5, which of course was an evolution of the Vapor 4 with the full lace cover and pretty well the exact same sole plate and stud pattern. It eliminated the heel counter on the outside made from glass fiber and reintroduced a much more traditional heel lining material with plenty of padding, making this arguably the most comfortable Mercurial Vapor to date. It had a little bit of Superfly spice with the Flywire panel with the Teijin synthetic upper here on the medial side. And as far as older Mercurials go, this is probably the most wearable one out of all the earlier models, but still by today's standards from a performance standpoint, they're on the bulkier side, they're not necessarily very lightweight, and they're certainly not as comfortable as modern day Mercurials. 2010, Nike introduces the Mercurial Vapor Superfly 2, the successor to what was arguably the most high-tech football boot the world had ever seen, that built upon the same concepts with a full Tasian synthetic upper, this time with significantly more flywire cables to add tons and tons of additional structure. This is easily the stiffest pair of football boots I've ever had on my feet, which is not a good thing when it comes to overall comfort. The boot gained a significant amount of weight, partially due to the upper that just felt a lot more substantial. It's not a super thin feel on the ball. The sole plate was also carbon fiber. By this point, I think the durability was a lot better. Holes in the heel studs, but the introduction of scent studs, these two rounded studs in the middle that actually have the ability to extend and retract a couple millimeters for the sake of basically adaptive traction. If the ground was a little bit harder, the studs would retract. If the ground was a little bit softer, they would extend for optimal traction. It also added the texturing around the tip of the toe, something that Nike would definitely follow through with on future Mercurial models. The scent stud traction element, it's kind of a gimmicky thing in that you really can't feel the studs or see them move whatsoever, but I always felt like the FG traction was actually really solid with these. They're cool football boots, super high tech, also crazy expensive, retailing for $400 for a regular model. This is the most expensive a Mercurial model ever got, but again, from a comfort perspective, so incredibly stiff, so incredibly uncomfortable, and just not a pair of football boots that hold up well today. And then alongside the Superfly 2, we also got the Mercurial Vapor 6. Again, a building on the Mercurial Vapor concept that was originally introduced on the Vapor 4 with the lace cover, still maintaining a Tasian synthetic upper, this time with a little bit of a different texturing. The flicker graphic, which was also found on the Superfly for the sake of better visibility for your teammates. Yes, that's something Nike was trying to push once upon a time, but I think most importantly with this model, the introduction of the glass fiber sole plate, which of course just looks really, really cool and would be featured on future Mercurial models over the coming years. It didn't really have any issues with cracking. It felt pretty much just like the carbon fiber one. Hard to say whether or not it's lighter or heavier based on the fact that we never actually got this on a pair of Superflies, but from a feel and performance perspective, it felt really nice and looked even cooler. Holes in the studs with the newer updated stud pattern that I would argue wasn't necessarily as good as what was featured on the Superfly, but still really aggressive and to the same standard that most people would expect from Mercurials at this point in time. From a wearability perspective, again, I would say these are actually pretty wearable, although not that great in terms of being kind of on the wider, higher volume side, not as comfortable as modern Mercurials, and from a touch perspective, just not as thin or as barefoot-like as I think most people have come to expect from this line. 2011, I would argue, is one of the more boring years in Mercurial history when Nike introduced the Mercurial Vapor Superfly 3, where if you're familiar with the Superfly 2, then you might be looking at these and saying to yourself, what's the difference? Well, the only real difference you're going to notice is that the upper is a smidge thinner, although that's debatable because that's not actually officially said from Nike, but they did introduce the additional lace hole and the fly wire that accordingly goes to said lace hole if you want that little bit of additional lockdown. Other than that, these are exactly the same as the Superfly 2 with the same $400 retail price, and again, by today's standards, incredibly stiff and incredibly uncomfortable. And as your cheaper alternative, Nike also introduced the Mercurial Vapor 7, which, as you can see, eliminated the lace cover from the Vapor 4, 5, and 6 and reintroduced a standard central lacing system with a standalone tongue, giving this much more of the early Mercurial Vapor 1, 2, and 3 look. It still had a Tasian synthetic upper, no flywire technology whatsoever, maintained the same glass fiber sole plate and stud pattern from the Vapor 6 that it replaced. And as far as modern day performance is concerned, again, not super lightweight, kind of on the chunkier side as far as Mercurials go, but definitely very wearable. I just don't think as good as what we have now. 2012. By this time, the Mercurial series is in a bit of trouble because when Adidas introduced the F50 Adizero at the 2010 World Cup, not only was that a football boot that was significantly lighter and significantly more comfortable, they were a heck of a lot less expensive than the Mercurial alternatives, and 2 years on from that boot, the popularity had grown significantly. So Nike introduced the Mercurial Vapor 8, a football boot that kind of took the Mercurial series back to its roots. You can definitely tell that this has a lot more of the Vapor 1, 2, and 3 vibe about it in terms of its overall shape, being a lot slimmer, a lot lower profile, and kind of having that sprinter spike look again, rather than the chunkier look that so many Mercurial models up until this point had. It also introduced ACC technology halfway through its run, which is something that a lot of people really gravitated towards. They played around a lot with texturing on the Vapor 8 as well. This particular colorway having kind of like an artificial leather grain texture, where a lot of them also had that kind of peach fuzz texture to them, and then some of the ACC models had a little bit of a different feel as well. And then the Teijin synthetic. They eliminated all the flywire and opted for a material that was as thin as we had ever seen on a pair of Mercurials, but for the first time ever, super pliable and borderline soft. So it gave you this premium barefoot feel, and I think more importantly than anything else, a football boot that was actually comfortable for pretty much the first time ever in a pair of Mercurials. Moving to the sole plate, it kind of reinvented the glass fiber concept, which still looked really cool, but arguably felt even better than any of the carbon fiber ones that were significantly more expensive on past Superfly models. And of course, the FG stud pattern controversially introduced the 2-heel stud system, where this was a bit of a concern in terms of durability. I know a lot of people snapped the heel studs off, and realistically, this particular layout, as good as the traction was on a perfect pitch that was really well maintained and kind of on the softer side, for hard ground and certainly for artificial grass, this was an absolutely terrible stud pattern. Nonetheless, these are amazing boots. I think they still hold up really well from a performance standpoint. They were lighter than a lot of the past Mercurial Vapor and Superfly models as well. These are very wearable by today's standards, although again, I wouldn't necessarily pick them over the current generation of Mercs. 2013, Nike introduces the Mercurial Vapor 9. Again, a slight evolution over the Vapor 8 in that it maintained pretty well the same Teijin synthetic upper, but again, playing around with texturing. It varied from colorway to colorway, but I think the most notable texture option was the golf ball-like dimpling, which Nike said would improve your touch, offer better grip, and just more consistency in terms of feel for the ball. That, of course, is always questionable in that it's very, very minimal, but it did look quite cool and obviously stood out from other football boots currently on the market at that time. Had the same glass fiber sole plate, the same FG stud pattern, and overall, they're just really solid football boots. I wouldn't say there's a significant difference between the Vapor 8 and the Vapor 9 in terms of wearability, where again, you could totally get away with wearing them these days, but I don't think they're as good as the current Mercs. 2014, another extremely important year in the history of football boots. Nike reintroduces the Superfly in the form of the Superfly 4, but unlike previous models, a completely different concept. This introducing Flyknit technology, a sock-like material with a mid-cut collar that made it visually distinctive, and honestly, in terms of fit, feel, and performance, we had really never seen anything like it. This boot, alongside the Magiste Obra, which technically claims the title of being the first Flyknit boot as it was unveiled a month earlier, really changed the entire football boot industry to this very day, in that knitted uppers pretty much have become the industry standard, or at the very least, every brand makes at least one. The Flyknit upper was super thin, very sock-like, arguably one of the more comfortable Mercurials Nike has ever made, despite some issues in the heel that you either had or didn't have depending on how well they fit your feet. A flywire-like concept in the form of Brio cables, which pretty much do the exact same thing, tying themselves to the lacing system and adding structure to what would otherwise be a really soft and pliable upper. And then of course, the introduction of a carbon fiber sole plate, once again in the Mercurial series. Super cool looking, but honestly not that noteworthy in terms of overall performance. And of course, a super aggressive FG stud pattern. This of course being an SG model, however, from a performance standpoint, these are still very wearable by today's standards. But again, would I pick them over the current day Mercurials? No. With that said, Nike did also offer a cheaper alternative in the form of the Mercurial Vapor 10, which I think is one of the most slept on Mercurial models in the brand's entire history. Unlike the Superfly, these did not have a Flyknit upper. Instead, you got a full thin Teijin synthetic upper with a unique one-piece construction we had never seen on a Vapor model before. The fit was phenomenal. The touch was incredibly thin. The boots were lighter than a pair of Superflies, and despite not having a carbon fiber sole plate, even though the mold was pretty much the same shape. The boots felt pretty well the same underfoot with a super aggressive traction pattern as well. For $200, this was a sleeper in terms of overall performance, and it's unfortunate that the Superfly got all the marketing attention because the Vapor 10 was and still is an excellent pair of football boots. Argument to be made that this is easily as good as any modern day Mercurial. 2016, Nike introduces the Mercurial Superfly 5, an evolution of the Superfly concept, maintaining a Flyknit mid-cut upper, flywire cables, but now introducing this ridge texturing across the entire upper for the sake of additional grip. All this really did from a feel standpoint is make the upper feel a little bit thicker, which I would argue was actually a downgrade over what was featured on the Superfly 4, but there was also an argument to be made that this material felt softer against your foot and was arguably a little bit more comfortable. They also seemed to slim down the overall shape, but for the most part, the boot really didn't fit that different from the previous model. I think the big change, however, was in the sole plate, getting away from carbon fiber, which was very controversial and the first time we had not seen a carbon fiber sole plate on anything dubbed a Superfly, but instead this plastic sole plate with its anatomic shaping had a little bit of a contoured bottom to it, which gave you a more connected feel to the sole plate than I think anyone had ever experienced on a pair of football boots, and was also lighter than the carbon fiber one it replaced. It also introduced the chevron style FG stud pattern, which is very similar to what would be featured on the Mercurial model for several generations to come, and just recently got changed up. Super aggressive, really solid football boots, and while I didn't love all the changes they did to the upper, I think they're really good in terms of performance, and again, stack up well to today's performance standards. And for those looking for that more traditional Mercurial feel, Nike also introduced the Vapor 11, which featured, instead of Flyknit, a thin Teijin synthetic upper as we've come to expect from the Mercurial Vapor series, but with the introduction of a rib texture on the surface that I felt was more noticeable in terms of additional grip on the ball on the Vapor than it was on the Superfly. One-piece upper construction, a low-cut design, of course unlike the Superfly alternative, and an overall shape that was a little bit slimmer and lower profile than the Vapor 10 that it replaced, giving this a super tight wrap on your foot, and of course, and for the first time ever, sharing the exact same sole plate and stud pattern as the Superfly with that anatomic shaping. From a performance standpoint, this is arguably a top 3 Mercurial model of all time, and easily very wearable by today's standards. 2018, another huge year for the Mercurial series in that for the first time ever, the Superfly and the Vapor was no longer a choice that you really had to make, and that's not because they didn't offer a Superfly 6 to replace the Superfly 5, and not because they didn't offer a Vapor 12 to replace the Vapor 11, but because the Superfly and the Vapor were now exactly the same thing, the only difference being the addition of a collar and an extra $25 slapped onto the price tag if you opted for the Superfly variation. No more Teijin synthetic, both boots were now full Flyknit uppers with this 360 wrap technology that Nike was really pushing, that realistically it's just a split sole, there's still a sole plate, you couldn't feel any Flyknit wrapping underneath your foot, and the Flyknit upper as a whole, while it felt okay, I don't think it's anywhere near as nice as what was featured on the Superfly 4 or the Superfly 5. If anything, I felt like this was a generation of Mercurial that was relatively uninspired, and while the comfort was definitely there, they did make the shape a little bit wider, they added some volume to the football boot, and again, tried to make it more accessible to more people, which I think lost a little bit of that Mercurial magic for many, even though the boots were arguably more comfortable than what they were doing before. It also introduced a new split sole construction with a slight refinement to the sole plate that again was heavier while still maintaining the anatomic shaping to it. In general, this I think is a very forgetful take on the Mercurial series, but as far as performance is concerned, still very wearable and holds up well to today's standards. 2019, Nike once again introduces a new generation of Mercurial, this time the Superfly 7 and Vapor 13, once again the exact same football boot with or without a collar, and it built on the same concept introduced with the previous generation, this full Flyknit upper, but this time introducing a technology called high tenacity yarns, which similar to the Flywire concept, introduced structured elements to the the upper within the knit itself. Rather than having targeted strips that could create pressure points, they strategically placed firmer, more structured yarns in the areas of the upper that needed it most, and the end result was a fly knit upper that gave you that sock-like comfort on your foot, but also an incredible amount of lockdown responsiveness, not to mention a great feel for the ball. They also slimmed out the boots, refining the shape in such a way that made them feel much more Mercurial-esque, and even changed up the sole plate and stud pattern ever so slightly, just feeling that little bit more springy. The weight also came down slightly, and this I think goes down as one of the best performing Mercurial models of all time, and from a comfort perspective, arguably the most comfortable ones ever. From a performance standpoint, these are still fantastic. 2021, Nike introduces the Mercurial Superfly 8 and Vapor 14, a football boot that for the first time in a while for the Mercurial series did not feature a full fly knit upper, instead swapping out the fly knit for a material called Vaporposit, which is still a textile-based synthetic material, as you can see by the grid pattern that runs throughout the upper, but it's reinforced by internal pieces of basically microfiber that vary in terms of pattern and shape, still maintaining a fly knit element across the top of the foot on the Superfly, of course maintaining the mid-cut fly knit sock, but more or less offering a feel that was kind of a middle ground between the soft sock-like fly knit feel and the more plasticky, thin, barefoot sensation that we've come to expect from the Mercurial series with Paisian synthetic. I don't think it quite meets the peaks of either of those materials as kind of an all-in-one concept, but it still felt quite good and obviously still performs as well as pretty much anything. The sole plate and stud pattern is also a slight refinement over the previous model, and even though this boot was just recently replaced with a new model, they are easily as good as pretty much anything currently available. 2022, the Nike Mercurial Superfly 9 and Vapor 15, the introduction, or should I say reintroduction, of Air Zoom tech, mainly through the forefoot, but it does flow slightly through the midfoot as well. If you remove the insole and take a look on the inside, you have a 3/4 length Zoom unit designed specifically for football boots, all in the name of responsive cushion. But realistically, the cushion part, I think, is what needs to be emphasized here, in that it does give you that springy sensation without feeling mushy or without feeling unstable. It's a feeling when running that you simply will not get from any other pair of football boots, and to me, the main attraction of the latest generation of Mercurial. It also features a Vaporposit Plus upper, which is a refinement over the previous generation that I don't think realistically feels that different. It's a different pattern in terms of the textile base, now in a chevron pattern, and you have their new speed cage system as a reinforcement, so the lining is quite a bit different. It's arguably a little bit thinner, arguably a little bit more pliable, and maybe trends more towards the Paisian synthetic days of the Mercurial series, which I think a lot of people would be happy about. But for me, the star of the show is the feel of that Zoom unit that I don't necessarily think makes the performance of the boot drastically better than all past Mercurial models, but it makes it distinctive compared to all of them, but in a very positive way. It's an addition to what has made the Mercurial line so special over all these years, along with a brand new tri-star shaped stud pattern that, again, is pretty much as aggressive as any past Mercurial stud pattern. Given the choice to wear these or any past Mercurial model, not to have recency bias, but this is the boot that I'd be wearing.